On March 15, 2023, David Narkai, a 58-year-old Apache tribal ranger and former U.S. Forest Service tracker, disappeared while investigating unusual activity in the Mogollon Rim wilderness of Arizona. His truck was found abandoned at an unmaintained Forest Service road approximately 22 miles northeast of Payson. The official search lasted 6 days before being called off due to severe weather conditions. 3 weeks later, Narkai emerged from the wilderness over 40 miles from his last known location, suffering from extreme dehydration, exposure, and what medical professionals described as unusual lacerations and contusions inconsistent with typical wilderness injuries. He had lost 28 pounds. During his debriefing with tribal authorities and reluctant meetings with federal investigators, Narkai provided an account that was officially classified as a stress-induced hallucination resulting from environmental exposure. What follows is his account. My name is David Narkai. I am 58 years old. I was born on the San Carlos Apache Reservation, but spent most of my adult life working as a wilderness guide and eventually as a tracker for the U.S. Forest Service. For the past 12 years, I've served as a tribal ranger, monitoring our sacred lands and ancestral territories that border state and federal wilderness areas. My grandfather was a medicine man who taught me the old ways of tracking and survival. My father worked 30 years for the Bureau of Indian Affairs before returning to traditional practices in his retirement. I exist between these worlds, trained in modern land management techniques but raised with the knowledge that the mountains hold secrets the government pretends not to see. I know these lands like I know my own heartbeat. Every ridge, every drainage, every seasonal spring. I've tracked mountain lions that were taking livestock. I've found lost hikers when official search parties gave up. I've documented archaeological sites that the Forest Service conveniently overlooked when approving development projects. When strange things happen in our ancestral territories, the tribal council calls me first, not the sheriff's department. I don't spook easily. I don't believe every shadow contains a spirit, but I know when something is wrong in the natural order. The trouble started when 3 hunters from Phoenix reported something strange near the northern boundary of our protected tribal lands. They were white men, experienced outdoorsmen who had hunted the region for decades. They came to the ranger station instead of posting online or calling the state wildlife agency. That itself was unusual. They spoke to me directly because the youngest of them had worked with my cousin at Salt River Project. Their faces were gray. They hadn't slept in 2 days despite having a comfortable camp set up with an RV at a designated site. They had packed up in the middle of the night and driven straight to our station. They described finding a deer carcass like none they had ever seen. The animal had been systematically dismembered, not eaten, not scavenged, but taken apart with what appeared to be precision and purpose. Organs removed, bones arranged, the skull positioned facing east. They showed me pictures on their phones. I've seen mountain lion kills, bear feeding sites, coyote packs work, and human poachers waste. This was none of those things. The precision was what disturbed me most. The cuts were clean, the arrangement was deliberate. It looked ceremonial, but not from any tradition I recognized. The hunters also reported strange vocalizations at night, not coyotes, not elk boogling, not owls. They described it as a rhythmic series of calls that seemed to be answered from different directions, creating a perimeter around their camp. When I asked them to imitate it, they couldn't. Their hands shook when they tried. The oldest man, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s, said, "I've heard monkeys in Southeast Asia that sounded more human than whatever this was." They reported the feeling of being watched constantly. Their dogs refused to leave the RV on the second night. The hunters were adamant they would never return to that area. I took their report seriously. I've received similar accounts over the years, enough that patterns had emerged, always in the same general region, always describing similar phenomena. The tribal council usually instructed me to document these reports but take no direct action. My grandfather had told me stories about the tall people who lived in the highest forests, who had been there before our people arrived, who had made agreements with our ancestors to respect boundaries. They are not evil, he would say, but they are not men. They do not think as we think. They do not want what we want. But they remember every promise and every betrayal. I had reported similar incidents to my Forest Service contacts over the years. They had a classification for such reports: UBPs, or unexplained biological phenomena. These reports were collected, documented, and then effectively buried. Once, after a particularly disturbing incident involving a family of hikers in 2016, my supervisor at the time, a career Forest Service ranger named Michael Blackwood, had gotten drunk during a training weekend and admitted to me that there was an unofficial federal task force that specifically investigated these cases. They show up, take our reports, tell us to forget about it, and then classify everything, he said. They've been doing it since the 70s. There's a whole warehouse of this stuff somewhere. The council would have told me to simply file the report. But I had noticed increasing incursions into this sensitive area. Not just recreational hunters, but resource exploration teams with federal permits. A Canadian mining company had been conducting geological surveys less than 10 miles from the site, the hunters described. My people had been fighting these permits for years, but the federal courts kept ruling against us. I suspected the mining company's activities might be disturbing something in that region, pushing it closer to areas where humans typically went. I decided to investigate personally. I told the tribal council I was doing a routine patrol of our northern boundaries to check for illegal woodcutting, a common problem that time of year. I told my wife I would be back in 2 days. I packed my truck with standard gear, my tracking kit, camping equipment, 3 days of food and water, always pack an extra day. My grandfather's medicine pouch, my .3006 rifle, and a sidearm. Standard equipment for backcountry work in mountain lion and bear territory. I brought a satellite phone and a handheld GPS unit. I wore my official tribal ranger uniform, olive green tactical pants, tan shirt with patches, and my official badge. Sometimes official appearances prevent confrontations with the wrong people. I drove to the area the hunters had identified, which sat at the intersection of tribal land, Forest Service land, and a parcel that had recently been transferred to the Bureau of Land Management in a controversial land swap. The dirt road became increasingly rough as I approached the GPS coordinates. It had rained 2 days before, and the ruts were deep. I had to engage 4-wheel drive for the last 3 miles. I parked at the end of the navigable road and continued on foot, following the hunters' description of their path to the site. I followed these tracks away from the carcass site. They led up the slope toward higher elevations. The stride length increased on the incline, suggesting the being was easily navigating the steep terrain. I tracked them for approximately 2 miles before they intersected with another set of similar tracks coming from the east. Then a third set joined from the north. They converged at a small clearing beside a seasonal stream, now reduced to a trickle in the autumn dry season. At this convergence, I found disturbing evidence of long-term occupation. The ground was unusually compacted in a circular area, approximately 30 feet in diameter. Around the perimeter were small arrangements of stones, 3 stones stacked vertically, spaced at regular intervals like boundary markers. At the center was a structure I struggled to classify. Not quite a shelter, not quite a marker. Branches had been woven together to create a dome-like framework about 7 feet tall. The branches weren't broken but appeared to have been carefully bent while still living, then allowed to continue growing in these unnatural positions. Some were recent, still green with living pine needles. Others were older, weathered, suggesting this structure had been maintained over time, not simply built once. The implications disturbed me deeply. This showed planning, cooperation, and continuity of purpose. It showed intelligence and intent. I took more photographs, feeling increasingly uneasy. The clearing was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind through the pine needles. Just complete stillness. In 25 years of backcountry work, I had never experienced such absolute silence in a forest setting. It felt wrong. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I decided to turn back. The sun was lowering, and I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. I needed to return to my truck before dark. I could come back with additional equipment, maybe bring my cousin Thomas, who was also a ranger. 2 sets of eyes would be better. I carefully backed away from the clearing, maintaining awareness of my surroundings. I followed my own tracks back toward the deer carcass site. I was approximately halfway back when I heard it for the first time, a vocalization that began as something like wood knocking, a hollow percussive sound that could almost be explained as a woodpecker or a dead branch falling against a tree trunk. But then it changed, modulated into something like speech but not language, a rhythmic series of what I can only describe as whoops and mumbled syllables, rising and falling in pitch. It came from the ridge to my right, maybe 300 yards away. Then it was answered from behind me, closer to the clearing I had just left. The same pattern, same rhythm, but deeper in tone. Then a third call from the direction I was heading, directly between me and my truck. I was being triangulated. My grandfather had described this exact behavior, how they would surround a person who had crossed a boundary, who had seen too much. I immediately understood that my departure route was being cut off. I'm not ashamed to say that I felt fear unlike anything I've experienced in my decades outdoors. This wasn't the adrenaline spike of a sudden mountain lion encounter or the situational awareness of facing down an angry bear. This was ancestral fear, recognition at a cellular level that I was in the presence of something that existed outside my understanding of the natural world. I made a decision to change my route, to circle wide to the west and approach my truck from a different angle. I moved as quietly as possible, using all the stalking skills I had learned from my grandfather and my years as a tracker. I stayed in deeper cover, used drainages for concealment, and kept trees between myself and the directions from which I'd heard the calls. The light was fading faster than I anticipated. The forest canopy dimmed the day prematurely. I would be navigating in full darkness soon. I increased my pace, still trying to maintain stealth but prioritizing distance covered. My GPS showed I was still 2.4 miles from my truck, having added distance with my circuitous route. I could make it before complete darkness if I maintained my pace. The calls continued, changing position. They were tracking me despite my attempts at stealth. They were anticipating my movements, cutting angles to stay ahead of me. I realized they knew these woods far better than I did, despite my confidence in my territorial knowledge. This was their home in a way it would never be mine. I was within a mile of my truck when I saw the first one. The light was dim but not yet gone, that deep blue twilight that makes shapes difficult to differentiate from shadows. It stepped from behind a massive ponderosa about 80 yards ahead of me. Its height was the first thing that registered, well over 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8. Its proportions were humanoid but wrong, arms too long, torso too thick, legs slightly bent in a way that reminded me of a stalking cat ready to pounce. It was covered in hair, not fur, not a coat like a bear, but hair like a human might have if human hair grew everywhere and darkened with exposure and age. The color was difficult to discern in the failing light, but it appeared to be a deep reddish-brown, almost black in places. Its face was the most disturbing feature, too flat, too wide, with deep-set eyes that caught what little light remained and reflected it back with a dull reddish glow. Not the bright eyeshine of a nocturnal predator, but something more unsettling, the look of intelligence assessing me from behind those eyes. It stood completely still, watching me. It made no threatening movement. It did not call out. It simply observed, its massive head turning slightly to track me as I froze in place. I slowly moved my hand toward my sidearm, but some instinct told me that would be a catastrophic mistake. This being was allowing me to see it. Threatening it would change the nature of our encounter. I remembered my grandfather's teachings. I slowly raised both empty hands to shoulder height, palms forward, the universal sign of peaceful intent. I lowered my eyes slightly, not making direct eye contact, which many animals and human cultures perceive as a challenge. I spoke quietly in Apache, using a greeting that translates roughly to, "I recognize your rightful place." The being remained still for several seconds. Then it deliberately raised one massive hand and mirrored my gesture, palms forward, a clear indication of communication and understanding. It held this position briefly, then deliberately turned and walked behind the tree again. It did not reappear. I stood frozen, uncertain what had just happened. Had it accepted my acknowledgement and granted me passage? Was it simply repositioning? I waited, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it could be heard for miles. After perhaps 2 minutes of complete stillness, I cautiously resumed my path toward my vehicle, giving the tree where the being had stood a wide berth. I maintained the same deliberate, quiet pace, still moving with purpose but trying to project non-threatening intent with every step. I had covered perhaps 200 yards when the calls resumed, but with a different quality now, less coordinated, more urgent. They were coming from multiple directions again, but their pattern had changed. They sounded almost like commands or warnings being relayed. I increased my pace to a fast walk, no longer prioritizing stealth over speed. My truck was less than half a mile away now, according to my GPS. Darkness had fully descended, and I was navigating by the dim light of the GPS screen and my small tactical flashlight. I heard movement in the forest around me, heavy footsteps moving parallel to my route, branches breaking under significant weight. More than one set, more than two. I was being paced on multiple sides. I began to jog, then run. My training told me running was a mistake, that it triggered prey instincts in predators, but these weren't predators in any conventional sense. These were intelligent beings making coordinated decisions. I could see the reflective tape on my truck's bumper in my flashlight beam when something massive stepped directly into my path, not 20 yards ahead. Different from the first being I'd seen, larger, darker, its silhouette suggesting greater shoulder breadth. It made no sound, but its posture was unmistakably blocking. Not threatening, its arms were at its sides, but definitively preventing my forward progress. I stopped immediately. The forest went completely silent again. No insects, no night birds, no rustle of needles in the breeze. Nothing, just my own ragged breathing and pounding heartbeat. From behind me came a low vocalization, not the calling pattern I'd heard before, but a single sustained sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. A sound no human throat could produce. A sound that conveyed meaning without words. I understood with absolute clarity that I was being herded, directed, moved according to their will rather than my own. I slowly turned around, pointing my flashlight into the darkness behind me. 3 sets of eyes reflected the beam back at me, positioned at varying heights above the ground, the lowest pair still higher than my own eye level. They were spread out in a rough semicircle, closing off my retreat. Combined with the massive figure blocking my path forward, I was effectively surrounded. I made a desperate calculation. I switched off my flashlight, plunging the forest into absolute darkness broken only by fragments of moonlight penetrating the canopy. I dropped to the ground and rolled sideways, using a technique I'd learned for evading detection. I scrambled on all fours toward a drainage ditch. I recalled being several yards to my left, hoping to use it as a concealed escape route. I had moved perhaps 10 feet when a massive hand closed around my upper arm. The strength in that grip was unlike anything I've experienced. Not crushing, not violent, but completely immovable, like being held by living stone. I could feel the texture of the palm against my skin where it gripped below the sleeve of my uniform shirt, rough, calloused, but unmistakably a hand with fingerprints and creases. A hand that demonstrated tool use and manual dexterity developed over generations. I was lifted bodily from the ground with no apparent effort. My boots dangled a foot above the forest floor. I still couldn't see clearly, but I could sense the immense figure holding me at eye level, examining me in the darkness. I could smell it now. Not the rank animal musk I would have expected, but something more complex. Smoke from wood fires, pine resin, a mineral smell like wet clay, and underneath it all, something distinctly primate, but not human. It made that same chest-vibrating vocalization, so close now that I felt it pass through my body like a physical force. Then it set me down, turning me in a specific direction, not toward my truck, not back the way I had come, but toward the east, deeper into the wilderness. It released my arm but remained directly behind me. I understood with perfect clarity that I was meant to walk in the direction I had been pointed. I saw no alternative. Fighting was futile. Running was impossible. I began walking, using my flashlight to illuminate the ground immediately before me, but not daring to shine it around to verify what I already knew, that I was being escorted by multiple beings through the darkened forest, led away from safety and deeper into their territory. We walked for hours. The beings maintained a perimeter around me, visible occasionally when moonlight broke through the canopy or when their movement disturbed branches in my peripheral vision. They matched their pace to mine without apparent effort, their long strides covering ground so efficiently that they seemed to barely move while I struggled over uneven terrain. When I slowed from fatigue, a low vocalization from behind would prompt me to continue. When I veered from the apparent intended path, a figure would materialize at the edge of my vision, redirecting me with its mere presence. We moved generally eastward, climbing steadily in elevation. The forest changed around us. Ponderosa, giving way to mixed conifer, then to spruce and fir as we ascended. My GPS showed we had traveled nearly 7 miles from my truck. We were well outside normal patrol boundaries, into some of the most remote wilderness in the region. This was a landscape of box canyons, hidden plateaus, and maze-like rock formations, places that received perhaps one human visitor per decade, if that, places where anything could exist without detection. Near dawn, we reached what appeared to be our destination, a high, sheltered basin surrounded by vertical rock walls on 3 sides. A small spring emerged from the rock face, creating a clear pool before draining away down the slope we had ascended. The basin contained a grove of ancient trees unlike those in the surrounding forest, massive gnarled junipers that must have been centuries old, their twisted trunks creating natural shelters and chambers. As light gradually filled the sky, I could see evidence of long-term habitation throughout the basin. Structures similar to the one I had found earlier dotted the area, some small, some large enough for these beings to enter in a crouched position. There were stone arrangements, some clearly functional as wind barriers or fire reflectors, others in patterns whose purpose I couldn't determine. Most disturbingly, I saw bones, not just deer and elk, but what appeared to be larger mammals including bear and what I was certain were cattle. As full daylight arrived, I got my first clear look at my captors. There were 7 of them visible in the basin, varying in size, coloration, and what I can only describe as apparent age. The largest stood nearly 9 feet tall, with a massive barrel chest and silver-shot dark hair covering its body. The smallest, though still larger than any human, appeared younger, its hair more uniformly reddish-brown, its movements more agile and quick. Their faces confirmed what I had glimpsed in the twilight, broadly humanoid but with significant differences. The brow ridge was prominent, the nose wide and flat, the mouth larger than a human's with teeth clearly adapted for omnivorous feeding. Their eyes were deeply set but undeniably intelligent, observing me with what I can only describe as cautious curiosity. They communicated with each other through a complex series of vocalizations, gestures, and what seemed to be facial expressions, though their features were less mobile than human faces. I was directed to sit near the spring by a series of gestures from the largest individual, whom I perceived to be the group's leader or elder. I complied, watching as they moved around the basin with clear purpose and social organization. They largely ignored me once I was seated, going about what appeared to be morning routines, drinking from the spring, examining gathered plant materials, checking the perimeter of their territory. I remained in that basin for 3 days. I was not restrained physically, but was clearly prevented from leaving by the constant presence of at least 2 beings at the single viable exit point. I was brought food, mostly gathered plants including pine nuts, berries and roots, but also raw meat that I could not bring myself to eat despite my growing hunger. I had some emergency rations in my pack, which they allowed me to access and consume. They showed particular interest in my equipment, examining my GPS unit, flashlight, and other tools with evident curiosity but surprising gentleness and dexterity despite their massive hands. On the 3rd day, the dynamic changed. The beings became agitated, their vocalizations more urgent. They gathered in what appeared to be a discussion or council, with significant gesturing toward the west, the direction from which we had come. The largest individual approached me directly for the first time since our arrival. It crouched before me, still towering despite the reduced posture, and made a series of gestures that seemed to communicate urgency and direction. It reached slowly toward my chest, and I remained still, fighting every instinct to recoil. It gently touched the badge on my uniform shirt, then pointed to the west. The message was unmistakable despite the absence of shared language. My people, the authorities I represented, were coming. They were searching for me. The being then pointed eastward, deeper into the wilderness, then back at itself and the others. Then it pointed at me and gestured westward again. It was telling me our paths would now diverge. They would retreat further from human presence, and I would return to my world. It then did something I still struggle to comprehend. It reached into a pouch-like arrangement of woven plant material hanging at its side, and withdrew an object that it placed on the ground between us. The object was a badge, an actual US Forest Service law enforcement badge, tarnished and bent but unmistakably official. Next to it, the being placed a small metal canister that I recognized as an old-style film container, the kind photographers used decades ago before digital cameras. The message was clear and disturbing. They had encountered my kind before. They had collected objects from those encounters. They understood what I represented and the systems I was connected to. This wasn't first contact. This was the continuation of a relationship spanning generations. The being stood to its full height, gesturing once more for me to go west. Two others appeared at the basin's entrance, clearly prepared to escort me out. I gathered my belongings with shaking hands, securing the badge and film canister in my pack. As I prepared to leave, the leader made one final communication. It picked up a stick and deliberately broke it, then placed the pieces side by side on the ground. It then used its massive foot to obliterate a section of clear tracks that one of the younger beings had left in a patch of soft earth near the spring. Again, the message was unmistakable. Break connections, erase evidence. It wanted me to understand that they were deliberately choosing to remain hidden, that the separation between our worlds was intentional and maintained from their side as much as ours. The journey out was as deliberate as the journey in. Two beings escorted me along a different route than we had used previously. We traveled for the entire day, covering ground with remarkable speed, though I was exhausted and struggled to maintain the pace they set. As the sun began to set, we reached the edge of a more frequented hiking area. I could see trail markers and the occasional evidence of human passage. My escort stopped at this boundary. One made a sound that seemed almost like a warning or admonition. Then both simply turned and disappeared into the gathering darkness with astonishing speed and silence for beings of such size. I stood alone on the edge of familiar territory, my GPS showing I was approximately 15 miles from a ranger station used seasonally by the Forest Service. I walked through the night, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate need to process what I had experienced. I reached the ranger station shortly after dawn to find it occupied by a search team that had been looking for me for days. My truck had been found, prompting a search and rescue operation that had been expanded when my satellite phone was discovered still in the vehicle's glove compartment. The official debriefing was an exercise in futility. I told a version of the truth, that I had been investigating reports of unusual activity, had found evidence that concerned me, and had become disoriented in unfamiliar territory after dark. I described falling, losing my equipment, and wandering for days before finding my way back to a recognized trail. I did not mention the beings. I did not show them the badge or film canister. I had seen how such reports were handled before. I knew what happened to careers and reputations when such claims were made officially. The medical examination revealed dehydration, exhaustion, and a series of unusual bruises on my upper arm in a distinct pattern that the doctor found inconsistent with typical fall injuries. I explained them as the result of sliding down a steep embankment and catching myself on a tree branch. The doctor noted in my file that the bruises appear to match a gripping pattern not consistent with the patient's explanation. This note was later removed from my medical record. 3 days after my return, I received a visit from two men identifying themselves as Department of Interior Special Investigators. They asked detailed questions about my experience. focusing particularly on any unusual wildlife observations or evidence of unauthorized human activity in the area where I had been found. Their questions were oddly specific, asking about vocalizations, track patterns, and physical evidence I might have collected. I maintained my simplified story, omitting any mention of the beings. As they were leaving, the older of the two men handed me his card with a direct number. "If you remember anything else," he said, "anything at all that seemed out of the ordinary, call this number. Not your supervisor, not local law enforcement, this number directly." The card identified him as part of something called the Biological Resource Anomaly Assessment Team. I've never seen such a designation before or since. A week later, the film canister I had been given somehow fell from my pocket in the tribal council office. The council elder, a man who had known my grandfather well, picked it up and handed it back to me with a knowing look. "They showed themselves to you," he said. "It wasn't a question." That night I showed him the canister and the badge. He wasn't surprised. "They've been watching the mining surveys," he said. "They know what's coming." He explained that according to our people's oral history, there had always been an understanding between our ancestors and the tall people. Boundaries were respected, sacred sites were shared but at different times. Resources were divided according to ancient agreements. The federal government has known about them since they started building the railroads, he told me. They've had teams documenting them for over a century. They have a warehouse full of evidence that will never see daylight. They know what's in those mountains. They've always known. I opened the film canister that night after returning home. Inside was a small piece of carved wood, shaped into what appeared to be a map of the region with specific locations marked by tiny burned dots. One of the dots corresponded exactly with the location of the Canadian mining company's base camp. I've never returned to that specific area, though I continue my ranger duties in other parts of our territory. I requested reassignment to the southwestern boundary, as far from that northern region as possible, while still remaining employed. My wife says I talk in my sleep now, making sounds that don't sound like language. Sometimes I find myself unconsciously breaking small sticks and arranging them in patterns I don't consciously recognize. I still have the film canister and its contents locked in a small fireproof safe in my garage. I still have the badge, though I've told no one else about it. Sometimes when I'm on patrol in remote areas, I hear familiar vocalizations in the distance, that rhythmic pattern of calls that defies description or imitation. I never investigate these sounds, I never report them. I turn around and find another route. The mining company's permits were mysteriously revoked 6 months after my experience. The official explanation cited environmental impact reassessment and cultural resource protection. The Canadian company filed a lawsuit that was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. The area has since been designated a restricted watershed protection zone with no public access permitted. I've seen increased federal presence in the region, unmarked vehicles, personnel identifying themselves as geological survey teams, but carrying equipment that has nothing to do with geology. They're monitoring the boundaries, they're maintaining the separation, they're keeping the secret, because acknowledging the truth would upend everything: land rights, development, resource extraction, the very narrative of human dominance. The government knows exactly what lives in those mountains. They've always known, and they will ensure that ordinary citizens never have proof enough to be believed. If you're reading this and you've had your own unexplained experience in the remote backcountry, know that you're not crazy. Know that what you saw was real. Know that there are places on this continent that have never truly been under human control, and there are beings that have watched our civilization rise around them while choosing to remain apart from it. And know that there are people in positions of power who will go to extraordinary lengths to ensure this knowledge remains in the realm of myth and tabloid headlines rather than acknowledged reality. The veil between worlds is maintained from both sides, for reasons neither fully understands about the other.